First sign something was wrong came on a Wednesday morning in February, the kind of gray, cold morning where the radiator in my office clicks and hisses and you're grateful for every cup of hot coffee. I was walking through the main floor of Whitmore Estate Planning, the firm I'd spent 31 years building from a two-person operation above a dry cleaner in Savannah into something I was genuinely proud of. 43 employees, clients from 3 states. A reputation built on one thing above everything else, that when you handed us the most vulnerable financial decisions of your life, we handled them like they were our own. I noticed it the way you notice a smell that doesn't belong. Nothing dramatic, just the way 2 of my paralegals stopped talking when I rounded the corner near the filing room. The way Denise at the front desk smiled a half-second too late. 31 years of reading rooms will do that to you. You develop a kind of peripheral awareness that doesn't turn off, even when you wish it would. My son-in-law stopped at my office around 10. He knocked on the open door the way he always did, easy and confident, the kind of man who'd never once in his life wondered whether he was welcome somewhere. "Good morning," he said, flashing the smile that had charmed my daughter 17 years ago. At 41, he still had that quality, effortless, disarming. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than I paid myself in my first year of practice. I asked him what brought him in. He said he was just passing through, wanted to check on the Henderson Trust documents my daughter had mentioned, needing signatures on. I told him those hadn't come across my desk yet. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, almost nothing. And then the smile returned. "No rush," he said. "Patrice mentioned it, so I figured I'd ask." After he left, I sat for a moment with my coffee getting cold and tried to name what I was feeling. Not suspicion exactly, more like recognition, the way you recognize a sound in your house at night that you can't quite place, but your body already knows isn't right. My daughter Patrice had joined the firm 4 years ago. I'd wanted that. I'd worked toward it, honestly. She'd gotten her law degree, passed the bar on the first try, and came in with real ability. I'd been proud in a way that felt almost embarrassingly complete. My firm, my daughter, my legacy continuing in the most literal way I could imagine. Her husband, I'll call him my son-in-law here, because that title is the most accurate description of what he was and what he stopped being, had joined 18 months later as a financial consultant attached to our estate services division. My husband Gerald had raised an eyebrow at that. Gerald is a quiet man, a retired high school principal, and he expresses concern the way a lot of quiet men do, by going very still and asking one precise question. He'd asked, "Is this wise?" I'd said I thought so. I'd said Patrice vouched for him, that his credentials checked out, that having a financial consultant in-house made sense for the direction we were taking the practice. Gerald had nodded slowly and not said anything else. I've learned over 44 years of marriage that his silences are often more accurate than my words. By the time February came around, I'd been noticing things for weeks without letting myself look at them directly. Client files that had been pulled and not returned. A meeting with the Albright family. Clients I'd personally managed for over a decade, that Patrice had attended in my place without telling me until afterward. Expense reports in the estate services division that had grown by nearly 40% in 6 months, attributed to what the documentation described as expanded client development initiatives. I didn't understand it all yet, but I understood enough to know I needed to stop avoiding it. I went to find Arthur Chen that afternoon. Arthur had been my head of accounts for 16 years. He was meticulous in the way that only certain people are. The ones who actually love numbers, who find comfort in columns that balance and distress in ones that don't. When I walked into his office unannounced, he looked up with exactly the expression I'd been expecting. Not surprised, something closer to relieved. I told him I wanted to review the estate services expense reports. All of them, going back 8 months. He pulled them up without saying a word about the fact that my daughter's husband had already reviewed those same reports with him the previous week and told him they were confidential pending a division restructuring update. I read for 40 minutes while Arthur pretended to work at his second monitor. What I found wasn't sloppy, I'll give him that. The individual charges were carefully sized to stay under automatic review thresholds. consulting fees paid to two entities I didn't recognize. One called Meridian Legacy Group, the other called Coastal Wealth Advisors LLC. Fees totaling across the 8 months just under $200,000. For services I could find no deliverables for. I asked Arthur if he knew what those companies were. He said he'd looked them up when the invoices first came through because he thought it was strange. He said he hadn't found much. He said Patrice had told him the fees were for specialized referral partnerships and that he shouldn't worry about it. I thanked him. I asked him not to mention my visit to either my daughter or my son-in-law. He nodded with the expression of a man who had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. That night, Gerald was in the kitchen when I got home, which is where he is most evenings. He cooks the way he did everything as a principal, carefully, methodically, with full attention. I sat at the kitchen island and watched him finish the chicken and tried to figure out how to begin. I told him I thought something was wrong at the firm. Seriously wrong. He put down the wooden spoon and turned around. I told him what I'd found. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question: "How much do you know for certain?" "Not enough yet," I told him. He nodded. "Then find out before you do anything else." I lay awake that night running numbers in my head. $200,000 in consulting fees to entities I'd never approved. A daughter who had begun routing client communications through her own email rather than the firm's systems. A son-in-law who appeared to know the contents of confidential expense reports before I did. The Albright family, the Duncans, the Forsyth estate. Clients I'd built relationships with across decades, suddenly being managed almost entirely by Patrice and her husband. I got up at 2 in the morning and sat at my desk in the study and started making a list. The next morning, I called my old friend and attorney, Winifred Okafor. She'd been handling my personal legal affairs for 20 years, and I trusted her the way you trust someone who has seen you at your worst and never used it against you. I told her what I suspected. She told me to document everything I could before taking any action that might alert them, and to be careful. If there was embezzlement involved, premature confrontation could give them time to move assets or destroy evidence. She also said carefully that if my suspicions were correct, the legal exposure for both Patrice and her husband could be significant. Criminal, not just civil. I thanked her and hung up and sat with that for a while. I thought about my daughter at 8 years old, doing her homework at the same desk while I reviewed case files. I thought about her at law school graduation, crying in the parking lot because she was so happy and didn't want anyone to see. I thought about the first time I handed her a case file of her own and watched her take it with both hands. Then I picked up the phone and called Marlene Hicks. Marlene had been my executive assistant for 14 years. She was 63, sharp, and operated with the kind of institutional knowledge that can't be hired or trained. It accumulates. If anyone had been watching what I'd missed, it was Marlene. I asked her to meet me off-site for lunch at a place 2 miles from the office, a diner we'd been to together maybe twice in 14 years. She was already in a booth when I arrived. She ordered coffee and didn't look at the menu. She'd noticed the same things I had and more, files accessed after hours. My son-in-law taking client calls that should have been routed to me. 3 long-term employees, people who'd been with the firm between 8 and 12 years, who'd left in the past 5 months after brief, private meetings with my son-in-law, exit interviews he'd conducted himself, though that had never been his responsibility. She said, quietly, that she'd heard him on the phone once in the hallway near the copy room, that she hadn't meant to eavesdrop but had, that he'd been talking about a timeline, about how they'd be ready to launch by spring, about how the client list was nearly where they needed it. She hadn't known what to do with that. She did now. I asked for her help. She gave it without hesitation, the same way she'd given me 14 years of everything else. Over the following 10 days, we worked carefully. Marlene pulled access logs from our document management system showing which files had been opened, when, and by whom. I engaged a forensic accountant through Winifred, someone with no connection to the firm, to review the financial records. And with the help of our IT director, a 32-year-old named Greg who'd been with us for 6 years and who went pale when I explained what I thought was happening, I gained access to the email archives for the firm's estate services division. What we found was worse than I'd let myself imagine. Meridian Legacy Group and Coastal Wealth Advisors LLC were both registered in Delaware 8 months ago. Both listed my son-in-law and Patrice as principals. Both were actively soliciting the firm's clients. Our clients, with pitch materials that used the Whitmore name, our methodology, and in some cases, language lifted directly from our client welcome packets. 19 clients had already been in communication with one or both of the new entities. 11 had received what appeared to be transition documents, materials designed to move their estate planning relationships to the new firms while maintaining the appearance that they were still being served by Whitmore. They've been building a competitor firm using my firm's resources, my firm's reputation, and my firm's client relationships for at least 8 months, probably longer. There was also this in the email archive. I found a thread between Patrice and her husband from 3 months ago. She'd written that she was worried I might notice the expense report irregularities. He'd written back that I was too focused on the big picture stuff to get into the weeds of the division financials, and that by the time anything raised a flag, they'd be far enough along that it wouldn't matter. He had written, "Your mother trusts you completely. That's the whole point." I read that sentence 4 times. I'm not sure I'll ever stop reading it. I didn't sleep much after that. I spent 3 evenings at my desk building a complete picture: the financial records, the email evidence, the client communications, the corporate registration documents for both entities. Winifred reviewed everything and told me it was more than sufficient. She said the question now was what I wanted to do with it. I knew what I had to do, but first I needed to be sure that when I did it, there would be no room for doubt, no possibility of walking it back, no version of events where my son-in-law could stand in front of the people I'd built this firm with and spin a story that made it seem ambiguous. I needed to catch them in the act, not just the past, the present. The opportunity came from Patrice herself. She stopped by my office one afternoon and mentioned casually that she'd been approached by the Pemberton family, a multi-generational wealth management situation involving assets in 4 states, exactly the kind of complex estate case that Whitmore built its reputation on. She said she'd been doing preliminary work and thought we should bring them on. She asked if she could arrange for me to meet with them the following week to formalize the relationship. It was perfect. The Pembertons would be the largest new client we'd taken on in 2 years. My endorsement would mean everything to them. My daughter knew that. Her husband knew that. And if their pattern held, what they intended was to use my credibility to sign the Pembertons and then route that relationship to one of their shadow firms before the ink was dry. I told Patrice I'd love to meet the Pembertons. I told her to set it up. Then I called Winifred. The following Friday morning, I came into the office early. I reviewed the Pemberton file that Patrice had put together, legitimate on the surface, but cross-referenced with an email I'd found suggesting the Pembertons had already been in contact with Meridian Legacy Group. I set up a call with the Pemberton family's attorney, a woman named Gloria DeShields, and I explained that I had concerns about some communications they may have received from an entity claiming affiliation with Whitmore Estate Planning. Gloria was alarmed. She confirmed that they had received outreach from Meridian Legacy Group and had assumed it was a division of our firm. She agreed to cooperate. I also called the 3 board members of Whitmore. We have a small advisory board, 3 retired attorneys who have oversight responsibilities written into the firm's founding documents. I asked them to be available Monday afternoon for an emergency meeting, confidential, and to trust me on the reason. Then I did one more thing. Gerald and I had recently updated our estate planning. As part of that process, I had opened a new investment account, a personal one, separate from anything connected to the firm. A high-limit account that I'd mentioned once, offhandedly, in Patrice's presence. I'd mentioned that I kept a folder in my home office with the login credentials and account summary. I'd mentioned it the way you mention things you don't want your children worrying about, briefly, as reassurance. I mentioned it again, just as briefly, during a family dinner 2 weeks before the Monday meeting. I mentioned that I'd been meaning to update that folder and hadn't gotten around to it. I mentioned that the account had done well this year. My son-in-law heard that. I watched him hear it. The folder existed, the account existed, the credit card connected to the account also existed, with a temporary spending limit I'd arranged through my bank, and with real-time transaction alerts sent to my cell phone. On Saturday morning, Gerald and I hosted Patrice and her husband for brunch. Halfway through, I excused myself with a headache and went to lie down. The folder was on my nightstand. I positioned a small security camera, the kind marketed for watching pets when you travel, on the bookshelf with a sight line to the nightstand and the door. I took a prescription sleep aid that I'd been given after a surgery 3 years ago and that I'd never used. I got into bed. I needed to be genuinely asleep if this was going to work. My son-in-law was not a careless man. I was asleep within 40 minutes. I woke up at 5 in the morning. Gerald was still asleep. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and saw the folder was gone. I checked the camera first. At 2:47 in the morning, the door to my room had opened. My son-in-law had come in, moving quietly. He'd stood at the foot of the bed for a moment, watching. Then he'd gone to the nightstand, taken the folder, and left. He'd been back in 20 minutes. In that 20 minutes, according to the app on my phone, my credit card had been used for an online purchase. A resort reservation in the Turks and Caicos. $3,400. By 9 o'clock Sunday morning, the total was $62,000. By Sunday afternoon, it was just over $90,000. I forwarded everything, the camera footage, the transaction alerts, to Winifred and to Arthur. I texted Marlene to confirm the Monday arrangements were still in place. Then I sat in the kitchen with Gerald and drank coffee and watched the light change in the backyard and tried to feel something other than tired. Gerald put his hand over mine on the table. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I will be." Monday morning, I dressed in the charcoal suit I'd worn to every important professional moment of my life. The one I'd worn when I signed the lease on the first real office space, when I argued my first contested estate before a probate judge, when I gave the eulogy for my first partner who'd believed in this firm before anyone else did. The Pemberton meeting was scheduled for 10. Patrice and her husband arrived at 9:45, confident, polished. She was wearing the gray blazer she knew I liked. He was carrying a leather portfolio that I recognized as new. The Pembertons arrived at 10. Their attorney, Gloria DeShields, arrived with them, which my son-in-law did not appear to have expected. His composure flickered, just slightly, when he saw her. I led the meeting. I explained who Whitmore Estate Planning was, what we did, and what we had built over 31 years. I explained our process. And then I explained that before we could discuss a formal engagement, I needed to clarify something with the Pemberton family about communications they had received from an entity called Meridian Legacy Group. The room went very quiet. I watched my daughter's face. I watched the moment when she understood what was happening. I told the Pembertons what Meridian Legacy Group was, who owned it, and what it had been doing. Gloria confirmed that her clients had received solicitation materials using Whitmore's name and branding without authorization. I provided the board members, who had joined the meeting at 10:30, as arranged, with the folders Marlene had prepared, containing the financial records, the email evidence, the corporate registration documents, and the transaction history for my personal credit card over the preceding 48 hours. My son-in-law tried to speak twice. The first time I held up one hand and continued. The second time, our board chair, a 71-year-old retired judge named Harold Pierce, told him that he would have an opportunity to respond when I had finished. He did not speak a third time. Patrice said nothing. She sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at the folder in front of her and did not look up. When I finished, Harold asked if they wished to respond. My son-in-law said there were aspects of the situation that had been taken out of context and that he would want to consult with an attorney. Patrice said, quietly, that she didn't think there was anything to say. I presented the same agreement I'd prepared with Winifred. Immediate resignation from all positions. Full restitution of the funds diverted through the consulting fees and the fraudulent credit card charges. Dissolution of both shell entities. A non-compete for 5 years within a 200-mile radius. In exchange, Whitmore would not pursue criminal charges. My son-in-law read it twice. He asked about the non-compete radius. I said it was not negotiable. He asked about the restitution timeline. Winifred, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, explained the payment structure. He looked at Patrice. She was still looking at the folder. "We'll sign," he said. They signed at 11:57. The Pembertons, to their enormous credit, remained. Gloria DeShields said that, based on what they'd just witnessed, she was confident that Whitmore was exactly the firm her clients needed. We had a preliminary meeting that afternoon. After everyone had left, I sat in the empty conference room for a while. Marlene came in eventually and set a cup of tea in front of me without saying anything. That's one of the things about people who've been with you long enough. They know when talking helps and when it doesn't. Gerald picked me up that evening. He'd offered to drive me in that morning, and I'd said no, and now I was glad he'd shown up anyway. We drove home mostly in silence. He made dinner. I sat at the kitchen island and watched him, the same way I had 2 weeks before, when this had all still been a feeling I couldn't name. "She called," he said after a while. "Patrice." I asked what she'd said. He said she hadn't said much, that she was sorry, that she didn't expect me to believe that right now. I didn't respond to that. I didn't know yet what I believed about my daughter and where it was possible to go from here. That was a question for a different evening. The weeks that followed were exactly as complicated as I'd known they would be. The official story was that Patrice and her husband had chosen to pursue independent opportunities, a mutually agreed transition. Most staff accepted this. A few longtime employees, the ones who'd known Patrice since she was 25 and coming in for Take Your Child to Work Day, were sad about it in a way that was hard to be around. I promoted Marlene to Director of Operations. The title should have been hers years earlier. The raise that came with it was, frankly, embarrassing given how long she'd been doing half the job without either. I restructured the firm's oversight processes so that no single division head could authorize expenditures above $10,000 without a second signatory. I brought on an outside auditing firm for a quarterly review cycle. Not because I didn't trust my people, because I'd learned, in the most expensive possible way, that trust without structure is not trust at all. It's just exposure. Gerald and I had harder conversations than we'd had in years. About Patrice, about whether I'd missed things I should have seen, about whether the way I'd run the firm, with my family at the center of it, had made this somehow inevitable. I didn't know the answers to all of those questions. I still don't. What I knew was that we'd stopped having the hard conversations somewhere along the way, and that had cost us. 4 months after the Monday meeting, Patrice came to see me. Not at the office. She called first and asked if she could come to the house. I said yes, and then sat with that decision for the rest of the day, not sure whether it was wise or just the thing a mother does. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping. The easy confidence she'd carried since law school was gone, and what was underneath it looked younger somehow, and uncertain in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager studying for the bar the first time and convinced she was going to fail. We sat in the back garden. I made iced tea. It was the first week of June, and the garden was full of the roses Gerald tends with more patience than I've ever managed. She didn't give me a speech. She didn't have a list of reasons or a prepared statement. She said that she had told herself for months that it wasn't really stealing, that she was owed more than she was getting, that the firm would always be there, that I would understand eventually. She said she'd known the whole time that none of that was true. She said she'd let herself be convinced that her loyalty was to her marriage, and that her marriage was to a man who'd been telling her for 3 years that I would always put the firm ahead of her. She said she was in therapy, that she and her husband had separated, that she didn't know what she was going to do next, professionally or otherwise. I asked her why she'd come. She said because she wanted me to know that she understood what she'd done. Not the legal version of it, not the version she'd had to sign her name to. The actual thing, that she'd betrayed the person who had given her everything she had professionally, including the belief that she was capable of more than she'd managed to be. I sat with that for a while. I told her I wasn't ready to talk about the future yet. That trust isn't a door you walk back through. It's a foundation, and foundations that have been damaged take time and the right conditions and a lot of work that can't be rushed. I told her I needed her to understand that what she did affected not just me, but 43 people who came to work every day believing in what we built, and 19 client families who had handed us the most important financial decisions of their lives in good faith. She said she understood. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for anything. When she left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched Gerald, deadheading the roses at the far end of the garden. He hadn't come outside while she was there. He'd given us that space, the way he always gives me space when I need it, and stays close enough that I know he's there. I don't know yet what Patrice and I will become. I know what we were. I know what we are now, which is something with a fracture in it, and something with the possibility of being rebuilt into a shape that's different from what it was before, but maybe stronger in the places where the repair holds. Maybe. I'm 63 years old, and I've learned not to make promises about things I can't see clearly yet. What I know is this: the firm is still here. The people who'd built their professional lives here are still here, doing good work, with better protections around them than they had before. The Pemberton family signed their engagement letter. The Albright family, who'd been in quiet conversations with Meridian Legacy Group without quite realizing what they were getting into, stayed with us when I called Dorothy Albright personally and explained with appropriate discretion what had happened. Gerald made his good chicken that Sunday evening after Patrice left. We ate at the kitchen table with the windows open and the sounds of the neighborhood coming through. A kid on a bicycle, a lawnmower somewhere down the street, the ordinary life of a Sunday in June. He asked how I was. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told him I was a woman who had built something real over 31 years, who had nearly had it taken from her by the people she trusted most, who had done what was necessary to protect it, and who was still here. I told him that some mornings that felt like enough, and some mornings it didn't. He said that sounded about right. I told him that I regretted one thing about the way it had ended, that I wished I'd had the conversations with Patrice that needed to happen years earlier, when there might still have been time to change the direction things were going, that I'd seen things I'd chosen not to see because seeing them was harder than looking away. He said that was probably true for both of us. I said yes, it probably was. We cleared the dishes together. Later, I sat in the study for a while with the lights low and thought about the folder on the nightstand and the camera on the shelf, and the daughter I'd raised who'd walked into my room at 2:47 in the morning and made a choice that changed everything between us. I thought about whether I'd do it the same way again. I would. Not because it was easy, because it was true, because the only foundation anything real can be built on is the truth. And the kindest thing you can do for someone, even someone you love, maybe especially someone you love, is to refuse to help them live inside a lie. Even when the lie is about you, even when you're the one they were lying to all along. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually means to trust someone. Not the feeling of it. The feeling is easy, almost automatic when it's your own daughter, your own family. I mean the structure of it. The way you build it or fail to build it over years of small decisions that don't seem to matter much at the time. When I look back at everything that happened with Patrice and her husband, I don't just see a betrayal. I see a long chain of causes, each one connected to the next, stretching back further than I wanted to admit. I see a daughter who was given access before she'd earned authority, and who married a man who taught her that entitlement was the same thing as ambition. I see a mother, me, who noticed things and looked away because looking directly was harder. I see a husband who asked one good question early on and then trusted me to handle what came after. None of that excuses what they did. I want to be clear about that. Patrice made choices. Her husband made choices. They chose deliberately and over many months to steal. From me, from the people who worked at Whitmore, from clients who had handed us the most vulnerable financial decisions of their lives. The chain of cause and consequence doesn't soften that. It just helps me understand it without going crazy trying to find the one moment where everything went wrong. What I've come to believe is that integrity isn't a quality you either have or you don't. It's something you practice the way you practice anything worth being good at, imperfectly, with effort, and with the understanding that the days you don't practice are the days it erodes. Patrice had ability. Real ability. She passed that bar exam on her first try. She had instincts I recognized because I'd spent 30 years developing them in myself. But ability without integrity is just a more efficient way to cause damage. The hardest part of this whole thing wasn't the Monday meeting. It wasn't setting the trap, or watching my son-in-law sign that agreement, or explaining to the Albright family why their files had nearly been rerouted without their knowledge. The hardest part was sitting in the garden with Patrice that Sunday in June and understanding that I had contributed to this, not by being too harsh or too demanding, but by being too easy on the things that mattered most. I had prioritized the surface of our relationship over its foundation. I had let Gerald's concern pass without really sitting with it. I had built a firm on honesty and then looked the other way when someone I loved showed me quietly that she hadn't fully learned it. That's not guilt talking. Guilt isn't useful beyond a certain point. This is just accounting. The same kind of clear-eyed accounting I've done with the firm's finances for 31 years. What happened? What caused it? What I can do differently going forward? Marlene got her promotion. The firm got better protections. Gerald and I had conversations we should have been having for years, and Patrice is somewhere in the process of figuring out who she actually wants to be, which is something only she can do. I think about her sometimes when I'm leaving the office late, locking up the way I have 10,000 times before. I think about what it takes to build something real, not just professionally, but in yourself. It takes the willingness to be honest when honesty is costly. It takes the courage to stay in hard situations rather than engineer your way around them. And it takes a kind of endurance that doesn't get talked about enough. The ability to keep going, keep building, keep choosing integrity. On the ordinary days when no one is watching and nothing dramatic is happening and it would be so easy to cut just one small corner. That's what I know now on the other side of all of it. The corner you cut when no one is watching is the same corner they'll find you in when everything falls apart.